Can I start by asking you some questions, Rabbi, about where you came from? What's your background? It's always interesting for us to know where your music originated from, what your history is, and how you brought it and use it now. So could you tell us? We'd like to hear you.
Sure. So I first want to say thank you to you and to Cantor Bruce Rubin for organizing this interview and for having me as a guest. And thank you to our mutual colleague, Serena Rafet, who introduced us to each other. And so I'll give you a little bit about background. My family is primarily of Syrian descent. My father, although he was born in Israel, his father was born in Syria back at the turn of the century, before the 1900s, and immigrated to Israel and to Jerusalem in the early 1900s. And by the 1930s, or the 20s or 30s, they were already living in Jerusalem. I was born here in the Syrian community in New York in the mid 60s, amidst an environment of Middle Eastern chazanut. But my father and my grandfather had also been immersed in that kind of a culture, especially my grandfather from the old country. And the village that he hails from is a town or a village in Syria which was known to be a town of Levites. Part of the Leviim culture is to perpetuate the nusach of the chazanut, and there's a throwback to the days of the Holy Temple.
How did you learn to chant your chants?
Basically, a lot of this was handed down from father to son, from grandfathers or uncles. The community in the time when I was growing up had chazanim that were very prominent in the 70s and 80s. Cantor Rafael El Nadav, of blessed memory, Cantor Meyer Levy, who's actually still alive and well into his 80s, who I'm in touch with. And then, of course, the later chazanim who came in the 80s and in the 90s, one of the leading chazanim in the Sephardic world, Cantor Yechiel Nahari, who was in Brooklyn in the 80s and the 90s, was teaching a class to a group of youngsters, myself included. And we would study with him in Congregation Sharet Zion for a period of years every week. And that's really the training we got. I mean, the type of learning we did was informal, but it was also semi-formal. And I went on to become an amateur chazan and then a professional chazan. And in 1996, I was asked to go teach a course in Middle Eastern chazanut at Yeshiva University. They couldn't find a Middle Eastern cantor who had a college degree in America at the time, going back 25 years ago. So for them, it was actually a very big opening, and for me, it was a great opportunity to put together a curriculum with then the director of the Bell School of Jewish Music at Yeshiva University, who is still alive and well. His name is Cantor Bernard Beer.
Did you teach with the Syrian mode or an Iraqi mode or all of them? And if so, how did you learn them all?
Okay, so I really just learned the Middle Eastern Judeo-Arabic mode. Right. Now, I'll clarify for you. I mentioned this in some preliminary conversations when Bruce and I had a chance to speak. It's important to define that the listener who is non-familiar with Sephardic Chazanut shouldn't think that this interview and this discussion is the end-all and be-all of the Sephardic Chazanut. There's at least 4 genres that I know of, genres of Sephardic Chazanut, which are different in their geographic origin. One of them, and probably one of the foremost in North America today, is the Judeo-Arabic. It's also known as the Halabi Yerushalmi Nusach, which Halabi Yerushalmi means the Aleppo/Jerusalem Nusach. The reason being because that community of Yerushalayim and the Jews of Aleppo really put a lot of effort throughout the centuries, and especially in the recent 50 to 100 years, to preserve the culture, probably more so than any other Middle Eastern community. But in addition to the Judeo-Arabic, there's also the Spanish-Portuguese community, which is a Western Sephardic Occidental tradition, which actually was the first Sephardic cantorial rite in the Western Hemisphere. And basically, their chazanut is a very old tradition, of course, as well, but somewhat different because it's Western and Occidental, whereas ours is Middle Eastern and Oriental. There's also the Yemenite right? And then there's the North African, Moroccan, Algerian style of prayer. Those are all four different types of Sephardic prayer. There are some similarities, but the melodies, the modes are different. And I just want to point out very briefly, from an academic point of view, I wrote a short article defining those genres and what would be the rubric when you have what you call in the Ashkenazi world a trup, what we call ta'amim. Each community has a different ta'amim, and those modes are distinct. The Judeo-Spanish tradition is interesting because some Chazanim classify that as a fifth genre. I like to think or say that the Judeo-Spanish is included in the Judeo-Arabic.
When you are working with a congregation, do you use any instruments? And two, does the congregation participate, or is this you sharing your music with the congregation? And if they participate, how do they learn from you?
So the participation, congregational participation in our community is actually extremely well developed, and in some synagogues even rampant in a very positive way. If there's a Brit Milah or a wedding, a life cycle event that's a happy one, and it's not Shabbat and it's not Yom Tov, which is often the case, then sometimes the Chazan will sing with instrumentation. But in the Shabbat and in the Yom Tov setting, it's strictly vocals from the Chazan and congregational singing from the community that backs it up.
I'd like a follow-up question first on that. If you do use instruments in those circumstances, what instruments would you be using?
It would be a keyboard that has Middle Eastern instruments. It might sound something like this. So that sounds like a canon, but it's electronic. So that would be an instrument. Violins would be a potential, violin and a keyboard, some percussion if it wasn't electronic from a darbuka. Those are the basic instruments that would, accompany that type of a musical life cycle.
One other question about, I understand you do lead a congregation for the high holidays. Is that in Brooklyn?
I performed as a professional chazan every week and every holiday up until about 2000, I would say maybe 5 or 6. So I left about 15 years ago, the week to week, but I've been working every year, I would say for the past, 2 decades or more, at least as a chazan on the high holidays, and even as a rabbi / chazan, because in our communities, very often the work of the rabbi is intertwined with chazanut. That's not to say that every rabbi is a chazan, but there are a few rabbis in the community who are very knowledgeable and sometimes even amateur or professional chazanim as well.
Thank you. Now, can you give us a sense of some of the congregations in Brooklyn that would follow your tradition, the Arabic Judeo-Spanish tradition?
I memean, we've really set the tone for not just the Syrian community, but all the other countries of the Levant, the Jews from countries of the Levant, like Lebanon, the Arabic-speaking parts of Turkey, Egypt, some Tunisians, that whole area, Iraq, even the Iranians as well are very comfortable in our nusach. But the mother synagogue of the Sephardic Middle Eastern community in North America, arguably, is Congregation Sharet Zion, which is in the hub and in the heart of the Syrian community, and has always prided itself on preserving the cantorial rite of the Syrian community and in general of the Arabic-speaking communities.
Thank you. I would be eager for you to talk a little bit about the system of makam, or Arabic modes, that underlie this whole tradition. If you can even give us a little example of the sound of some of them.
I'll reference a couple of scholarly works that are useful, and then I'll give you an example and describe it. Cantor Macy Nalman of blessed memory, who was the former dean of the Bell School of Jewish Music, wrote a paper in the 70s researching the Judeo-Arabic makams of the Syrian community in North America. I believe his work was a forerunner to 2 PhDs that were done in the field of makam study. One was Professor Kligman's work, at HUC, and also Kay Kaufman Shelemy from Harvard, who in both cases they interviewed extensively elders and cantors from the Sephardic community to do ethnomusicological studies. But basically, the makam system has musical connotations, and it has a practical application into the way we deliver the service particularly on Shabbat and holidays, but also on life cycles as well. And the makam system really is comprised of 8 main makams. 4 of them would resemble, and that's a key word when I say resemble. They're not identical to Western scales because they comprise the Western scale plus the microtonal intervals that are between, which would not be prevalent in every Western musical situation. But they would resemble the minor scale, the major scale, what they call the diminished, or I believe in the Ashkenazi Chazanut, I'm not proficient, but there's a Phrygish and a Phrygian. So they would resemble those 4, major, minor, Phrygish, Phrygian. And then, of course, there's 4 other main makams that are quarter tonal, and then there's infinite amounts of makams, but certainly dozens that we employ that are secondary makams that are combinations of other makams. For example, a 1 makam would sound like this. So I really just went up and down the scale. It resembles the minor, but it would be executed differently with intervals in between. Right, so you can see it's a variation, but it sits on the minor scale. We have a similar makam that makam is called Nahwand. Okay, another makam similar, which resembles the major, sounds like this. Right, so these makams also project the mood. So if you listen to this makam, you could tell me what kind of a mood would this give you? What kind of a feeling or a sensation emotionally?
Upbeat, happy?
Exactly. That's the happiest makam, and you will find that makam is very prevalent in the wedding celebrations and with musical accompaniment, because weddings are not performed on Shabbat, and that makam will carry a significant role in the liturgy of the wedding ceremony. It will be very visible and audible on the holiday of Passover and on the holidays of Shalosh Regalim, parts of the Shalosh Regalim. It would be tied into a Shabbat prayer, Shabbat Shahrit prayer, where the parasha is a happy one, like Yaakov Avinu getting married. Right. So then there's another makam would sound like, something like this. So what kind of a mood would that sound like to you?
Maybe yearning or maybe a pleading.
Excellent. You're terrific. You would do wonderful in my class at Yeshiva University. That's called makam Hijaz. I believe it resembles. Is it called Phrygish?
Or Ahava Rabbah, which is a mode that you'd use for pleading and things like that. Yeah. Right.
So we would use this makam for teshuvah, for repentance, for soulfulness, for when somebody passes away. Very often this makam is used for a hashkava, which is the equivalent of something like you would call a kel maleh rachamim. So it would be used. We use this makam is very prevalent in the piyutim of Yom Kippur and in many of the piyutim of Rosh Hashanah on the high holidays, the days of Od, the Yamim Noraim. So Macy Nolman writes in his article that it's associated with passing of righteous, death. We use it in the parasha of the passing of Yaakov Avinu, of the passing of Sarah, Chayei Sarah. So you won't find it being used too many times on Shabbat, because we want to be happy, but on the serious days, on the days of teshuvah, on the days of of mourning or passing, we will use these kind of makam to project that energy.
Thank you, Moshe. That was a wonderful introduction. I want to switch to focus on the Lechadodi and the Kedusha, because I want the viewers to be able to compare the style with other people we've interviewed from different traditions who've also sung Lechadodi and Kedusha for us. Tell me, what would traditionally be done for Lechadodi in terms of what makam, and is it mainly a congregational tune, or is it something that's more soloistic, or is it a combination?
There is one very well-known worldwide melody, which is used throughout the Syrian community and throughout the Sephardic Arabic communities of Israel and the other Sephardic communities throughout the world, which is used for Lechadodi. That's a constant. There are some variations in a couple of the notes, but the melody is rather constant. The tempo is constant. There are some variations in the text of it as well, but that's also rather constant. But basically, the what varies musically from a cantorial point of view is the lead-in. So in some communities, they will start from the Chun Ranana, but in many communities, like the Syrian community, and in very many communities in Yerushalayim, who maintain the tradition, they don't start from L'chun Ranana. They'll start from Mizmor David, and they'll actually skip L'chun Ranana. And you wouldn't find that being the case in the Moroccan community, and probably not in the Spanish Portuguese. But so they'll skip L'chun Ranana. They'll go right to Mizmor David. And in some communities, and very often Mizmor David is sung congregationally out loud as a chant. And then when they finish Mizmor David, they'll go right into Lechadodi. And the melody would sound something like Lechadodi likrat kala b'nei Shabbat nekabela shamor v'zachor v'dibur echad ishmi'anu el ha'meyuchad Amona echad u'shmo echad l'shem u'tiferet v'letila Lechadodi likrat kala Some communities will sing it faster, some will sing it slower, some will just read the verses and just say Lechadodi in the beginning, some will repeat the Lechadodi chorus at every interval. So those are the varying elements, but the melody is pretty constant, and it is well known throughout our communities from a very, very young age. And I want to point out, there are some fringe chazanim that will deviate from that melody on occasion and use another melody. They'll borrow from a different chant for Lechadodi, but you will not see that as the prevalent state of the art. I've been to some communities in South Florida where I heard the chazan borrow a melody that we use in Makam Hijaz for Lechadodi. And so they would adopt a melody like something like Lechadodi likrat kala b'nei Shabbat nekabela Lechadodi likrat kala b'nei Shabbat nekabela Shamor v'zachor v'dibur echad ishmi'anu el ha'meyuchad Hashem echad u'shmo echad l'shem u'tiferet v'letila, etc., etc. But that is not the norm. That is extremely fringe. I'm mentioning it for the sake of musicality, you may hear that in some communities that are literally out in the fringes.
Let's move to the Kedusha. Now, when we were talking a few days ago, I mentioned that it's a tradition in Ashkenazic Nusach to shift from mode to mode within the prayer at specific spots. And you said that's not the case in Sephardic tradition. Well,
it is definitely welcome, but under certain circumstances. Let's put it that way. Let's qualify. No intention to say that it's not done. It is done, and it's actually a great ability to show that. But the job of a chazan before he starts switching modes is to establish the first significant part of shahrit in the base makam of the day, and variate in it, and build on the lows and the middle and the high range of it. And only after, for the more professional hazanim, will only start switching from makam to makam very often after the kaddish. So basically, they'll variate it after the Kaddish. At that point, there's enough of a runway in the text and in the improvisational reading between Kaddish and Kriyat Shema. We're talking about Shachrit of Shabbat and Yom Tov. That over there, the creative change from one makam to another is welcome, and is often done in a very professional way. There are some traditions where, in the Kohanim, that some Chazanim are so proficient that they will change makams throughout the Kohanim on every word.
Wow.
And that's a skill, but certainly not in the beginning of the prayer. In the beginning of the prayer, you want a broad-based building of the makam, establish the makam for the congregation, have them sing the first couple of congregational pieces together in that makam. So you want to allow the congregation to sort of steep themselves in the makam.
Nice. Now, you mentioned improvisation. Are there motifs that can be mixed in, or is it a matter of ornamentation? Where does the improvisation come in?
So the variations are using the makam efficiently throughout different parts of the scale, a certain amount of ornamentation, and also with different ups and downs. So for example, let's pick makam Nahuan, just for simplicity. ועלו מושיעים בארץ ציון לשפוט את עשיו והייתה לעמוני המלוכה והיה עמוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה עמוני אחד ושמו אחד. So you see how I worked the bottom part of the scale, built it into the middle, and only went to the top at the very end to kind of close it. Later on, I will pick up a motif that is on the higher part of the makam, like here. And I'll work my way down from there.
That's wonderful. I enjoyed that very much. Thank you. Can you show us a little bit of the Musaf Kedusha so we can have that comparison with our other interviewees?
The makam of Musaf is oftentimes the makam of next week's Shachrit. If I was to take, let's say, makam Ajam. So the nusach for the Hazara. Amonai Sivanai Tiftah v'yagit ilatecha Baruch atah Amonai Elokeinu v'Elokei avotenu Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov El-Gadol, HaGibor והנורא העליון גומל חסדים טובים קונה הכל וזוכר שדה אבות ומביא גואל לבנה ונעלמן שמו באהבה מלך חוזר ומשיח מגן ברוך אתה אדוני. And they'll answer Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo Magen Avraham. And that would continue until the sentence before the keter. V'ne'eman ata l'chayot metim Baruch ata Amonai mechayeh metim. And the melody could be something like keter yitenu lecha Amonai Elokeinu Malachim Amone Malaim Amecha Yisrael Kevutzei Mata Yahad Kulam Kedusha Lecha Yishaleshu Kadavarei Amur. And everybody will sing that. You notice I took a low key because I wanted to make it user-friendly for everybody in the congregation to sing it. And then the Chazan will go into his solo, Vekara זה לזה ואמר קדוש 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 המוני צבאות מלוך כל הארץ כבודו לעומתם משבחים ואומרים ברוך כבוד המוני ממקומו. And it would continue. I mean, that could take up to 8 minutes, that one piece, but it would continue from interval to interval until the very end of the Kedusha. But if I was singing at a wedding, I might sing it on F, and it might sound something like this, you know. Veitan lecha Elokim mital hashamayim u'mishmanei haaretz ברוב דגן וטירון.
Moshe, we're pretty close to the end of our 40 minutes. Is there anything in particular you want us to know that we haven't covered?
Well, there's a whole world of makams that would have quarter tones. And it would have a different sound, and I have the ability to program a quarter tone here, so you can get an idea. So makam bayat, for example, which is a very basic quarter tonal makam, would sound something like this. It's a whole different sound. So imagine if you're listening to the prayer in this mode. ועלו מושיעים בארציון לשפוט את הרעיסיו והייתה למוני המלוכה. So that's a whole different sound, and there's multiple modes that have that kind of a quarter tonal configuration.
This has been amazing. It's been fascinating, and we've learned a tremendous amount from you. We really appreciate it.
The Brooklyn Jewish Historical Initiative is enormously grateful because we are learning, as we are speaking to different traditions in the Brooklyn synagogues, we learn. I as a trained musician, I'm learning so much, and I'm thrilled to hear you, and it makes me want to attend a Shabbat service.
Thank you. I was very happy to be here and be able to speak about this because my life has been dedicated to the Sephardic tradition and to perpetuating the cantorial rite and the minhagim and the halachot and the culture of the Sephardic world. And I've been privileged to be able to do that in my role as director of the Sephardic programs at Yeshiva University, and to have wonderful mentors there who over the past 20 years really cared about the Sephardic world and helped invest in the Sephardic program to make it what it is today. And I believe that I'm happy at a future date when you expand your studies to revisit your program and to do another podcast on a related topic in Arabic Chazanut.
Very grateful.
That'd be wonderful.
We'll see you on the web.
Okay. All right. Shavua Tov again, and thank you so much.
Thank you. All the best. Shavua Tov to you with well. Hazaku Baruch on your dedicated work to preserve the culture of the Jewish people.
We're having a wonderful time. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.